This week on Vice, the search for a cure for ALS.
We're fighting the clock. What I don't know is if there's enough time for my daughter.
How many people in the U.S. are getting your drug?
In the U.S., nobody.
The FDA is worried about safety. Every day that passes, he's losing more of himself.
In 2014, the Ice Bucket Challenge raised more than $220 million for research into ALS. Now, it put this fatal neurological disease in the national spotlight for the first time since Lou Gehrig's famous diagnosis in 1939.
Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
But for us here at Vice, this was already a very personal story.
My name is Angelina Story, and I work at Vice. I wrote the article for Vice.com. The worst part of the Ice Bucket Challenge is the people criticizing it. Critics of the Ice Bucket Challenge dismissed it as viral narcissism, where people were more interested in showing off than helping out. I wrote the article because the campaign raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and it brought attention to a cause that had been widely ignored for over 75 years. But that wasn't the only reason I wrote it. I was just having trouble typing at first, turning on my blow dryer, you know, the little things. And I didn't think anything of it until one day I went to spray suntan lotion, and the suntan lotion completely slipped out of my hand. And I remember looking down and thinking, oh my God, this is what paralysis looks like. Within a week, the best case scenario went from shoulder surgery to spinal surgery to something we can't treat. And I didn't know what something we can't treat was. Like, what is that? Like, would I just have like a really fucked up left hand for the rest of my life? Until my neurologist gave me a phone number to call for a follow-up. He's like, you need to call this for a second opinion. So the next day, I called, and the woman who answered said, thank you for calling the ALS and Lou Gehrig's Disease Center at Columbia. And I dropped the phone, and I just sat in my bed. I cried. People now know what ALS is, but most don't understand how quickly the disease destroys your body and how hard it is to find any kind of treatment. So I set out to do a non-traditional piece of journalism, reporting from the patient's perspective and showing firsthand the challenges we face. I started with one of the first commenters on my story, Robert Hebron, and his daughter, Beth.
Hi, my name's Beth Hebron. I'm here doing the Ice Bucket Challenge. Before I got diagnosed with ALS, I think the best way to describe my life was very active. I was working at a law firm in Washington, D.C. as a paralegal. And then on the weekends, I would go out at night till 2 or 3 in the morning like any young 20-something does living in the city. I didn't want just for a wheelchair. I wanted it to look good. You should see it in the dark. I need to get some like ecstasy or something.
You know, it started out with, she needs help cutting her food. Okay, you get over it, you deal with it, you move on. And then it's like,